Good afternoon. I'm Jim Duff, the Executive Director of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and it's my honor today to welcome you to the Society's virtual lecture platform. While the Supreme Court building remains closed to the public, the Society has pivoted to a series of lectures and discussions over Zoom. We do look forward to returning to the in-person programming in the court one of these days when we're able. But we also plan to continue these virtual lectures as well. It's been a bright light during the pandemic to be able to connect our programs to members who might not otherwise be able to travel to Washington to attend in person. And today's program is timed over the lunch hour for our West Coast friends. So we're happy to accommodate that, and we welcome all of you who are joining us. Today's program is a conversation with Professor Mary Sarah Bilder. Professor Bilder is the Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. Her book, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, received the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, and was a finalist for the 2016 George Washington Book Prize. Her recent scholarship is focused on the age of the Constitution and the framing generation. Also, transatlantic feminism, James Madison and the Convention record, and colonial and founding era constitutionalism, as well as Robert Morris, the early African-American civil rights activist and lawyer. She has taught at Boston College since 1994 and as a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and Columbia Law School. I'm going to start with some conversation and questions with Professor Bilder, and then we will take questions from the audience. And we ask you to please submit your questions in advance in the Q&A window of Zoom. We'll get to as many of those as we can. We're going to have a conversation today with Professor Bilder about her book called Female Genius, and we're going to advertise that. And at the end, I'll hold up a copy of it, and we sell it in our gift shop and at the Supreme Court, and it's available online, which I'll give you the link to at the end of our conversation. Professor Bilder, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
I'll begin with noting that you describe yourself in the book as not an originalist, but a constitutionalist. And what do you mean by that? You explain it well in the book.
Wow, that's like getting right to the heart of a controversial matter. I don't see myself as an originalist, and I've written kind of extensively about this. I've really come to believe that the Constitution was an emerging genre. That's what's so exciting about it in this period, and that in some ways the Constitution was still understood in its older understanding as a system of government, and that one of the extraordinary aspects of this sort of framing generation is the way that the Constitution begins to be seen, not even probably quite the way we see it, but in this new interesting way. And one of the reasons that I like thinking about the Constitution as a system of government is that it allows us to expand our understanding of who influences that system of government. It gives us a sort of bigger space to have a conversation. And so I tend to think about the Constitution as a system of government created by a framing generation. And that helps us kind of move outside of, our sort of traditional depiction of the people mattering being the people who are in the room, who we know are all white men, property owners, and, politically a rather elite group of people. And so I kind of like that. I kind of like that framing. I spent a lot of time thinking about the Constitution, and that's sort of where I am. And also for me, I come to this not as a constitutional litigator, not even as a law professor who writes about current cases, but really as someone who thinks that the really interesting thing about this period is the way that the history helps us understand sort of the aspirations of the period and some of the legacies we continue to live with today.
Well, your book sheds new light on matters that arose around the framing of the Constitution, and we're very grateful for your work on that. It's called, as I mentioned at the outset, Female Genius. That was a new idea in the 1780s and 1790s. Can you tell our audience what are the origins of that phrase, and why was the descriptor female necessary?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think back now to the moment where I sort of was like, oh, wait, that should be the title of the book. It's a phrase that I use that you see in contemporary literature in the 1770s and 1780s, really describing women. And it's a great concept because the book argues that this was a moment when people, particularly women, imagined that they had the opportunity to sort of recast a classic assumption about women, that they were in some ways inferior and therefore could not participate in the constitutional state by holding office or by participating in the suffrage, and could not participate in the same kinds of educational opportunities. And so what we see in this period, really beginning in the 1770s and then expanding into the 1780s, is people describing women as female geniuses. And what they mean by this is not what we might completely mean. Genius doesn't yet quite have its romantic sort of capacity notion of being a unique person. It's really referencing what we would think of as capacity. And so what we start to see is the word female attached to genius, which tended to be associated with men, as a way of arguing that that women were equal and that therefore they deserved to be able to participate. And in this period, what's really interesting is in education and in sort of politics. And I first came to this recognition really, and then of course the minute I saw it, I started seeing it anywhere in the book. The book's peppered with descriptions of female geniuses in those quotations. But there's a woman who writes a poem called The Female Advocate in the 1770s, and she names contemporary female geniuses. And one of them is Phillis Wheatley, the great American poet, African-American poet, who had recently been in London. And the moment you sort of see Phillis Wheatley described as a female genius, the significance of that phrase became really obvious. And then you see it positively used by people trying to advocate for female genius. And then I have a wonderful translation by Rousseau, where he describes you would not want your daughters to be a female genius scribbling and reading pamphlets. So we see it sort of used in both respects in this period.
Who was Eliza Harriot, and how did you learn about her? And I have many follow-up questions on this one, but we'll kick it off with that one.
Yeah, so the book really began, I was working on my, during the period that I wrote my earlier book on James Madison's Notes of the Convention, I at one point read every extant diary that exists of the summer of 1787. And probably the ones people are familiar with are, there's various note takers who take notes of the convention. But George Washington kept a really interesting diary, all of his activities outside of the convention. And in that diary, he described going at the very beginning. He's at the beginning of the convention. The Virginians showed up on time. The Pennsylvania delegates were there. They can't start on time because none of the other delegations have shown up. And Washington's waiting. And while he's waiting on May 18th, he describes going to hear a lady lecture at the college hall. And in the fall, he goes back to Mount Vernon and he rewrites that entry. He rewrote his whole diary because he had forgotten his regular diary in the summer. And he adds to that description. And he describes her actually as a Mrs. O'Connell, which wasn't her name. And he says she was sort of economically needed the money. And then he describes her lecture as tolerable. And so this stuck in my head, kind of like who is that lady? Honestly, I didn't know if she was highly unusual or not. I thought I might just never have learned about anybody lecturing. And and that word tolerable, people who are Jane Austen fans may know that that's what Mr. Darcy calls Eliza Bennet. And so tolerable has a meaning that is somewhat accepting. In certain ways, it has a slightly different meaning than we think of today. And so that was Eliza Harriot. That's how I came to her. And then after I finished my Madison book, I started working on this project about her. And she's just a remarkable person, born in Lisbon, Portugal, marries an Irish Catholic lawyer in 1776 in London. They spend time in London and Dublin, and then come to the United States. And in the United States, she's a very ambitious female educator. And right now, probably the first woman to give significant public lectures in Philadelphia. She gives them at what's now the University of Pennsylvania.
You used the phrase that Washington described in his diary as tolerable, and you suggested it may have a slightly different meaning then than it does now. Now it would not be viewed as great praise, but did you find examples, or are there examples of what Washington might have found intolerable by contrast? I mean, how to try to put it in perspective, what his reaction to her lecture was, and then we'll talk obviously a lot more about her lectures and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so interesting to me about this, and for people who are really interested in Washington, it's actually you could sort of expand about it. There's a lovely excerpt that the Mount Vernon magazine did from the book in the spring issue. This is an interesting aspect of Washington for somebody who was not formally educated, and he wasn't formally educated in Europe or any of those places. He actually in some ways was quite interested and expansive in sort of what he was interested in. And he has actually he has a school in Alexandria that he sponsors, and they write him, you sponsor it, you offer to fund the school and everything, and we're wondering, we'd like to admit women. And he says, wow, that hadn't really occurred to me, but I suppose you could have women at the rate of one woman for every sort of 4 guys. Okay. And so that gives you a sense of, he's willing to accept this. He's not going to be as accepting of it as perhaps some other people at the time are. But for me, the work Washington does in this book is he shows that there's a possibility, that this is a moment of contingency where some people who we might have assumed were very closed off to that possibility actually find it interesting and open their minds to it. And Washington, at the end of the summer of 1787, actually buys to take back to Mount Vernon 3 books that are all inspired by her lectures. One, a collection of poems that was James Thompson, one of the sort of poets that she read. One, The Art of Speaking by James Burr, which is actually what she was advocating people doing. And one, a book of geography, which is the kind of one of the sciences that she includes in her teaching. So he's obviously influenced her by her in a pretty deep way. Interesting.
And do you think his mere attendance at the lectures sent positive signals about?
Yeah, it was enormously, she probably delays her lecture in order for Washington to be able to attend, because the lecture was actually originally supposed to be Thursday night and she delays it to Friday night. He attends with Mrs. Morris, Mary White Morris, who is the wife of Delegate Robert Morris, and who Washington was staying at their house. And she's very sophisticated, Eliza Harriot. That's her sort of first and middle name. It's what she called herself, at understanding Washington's power to amplify her message. So this is an aspect of who she is and her family that make her probably almost maybe more sophisticated than some women who had grown up in the United States. Her father and uncle were respectively the governors of New York and New Jersey for a short period of time. And she grows up in a very ambitious admiralty family with an uncle who actually is an admiral. And so she understands the way that political power and political patronage can sort of amplify or expand your message. And she's very sophisticated about this. After Washington comes to her lecture is obviously then covered in the newspaper. She actually probably writes most of the correspondence about the lady lecturing herself and sends it into the newspaper. But then many newspapers across the United States pick that up, because Washington, other than Franklin, Washington's probably the only figure with that kind of national valence and selling power. And she then praises herself as an anonymous correspondence in describing Washington's attendance, and she gets quite a lot of mileage out of it. There's a number of articles describing her lecture that she or her husband probably wrote about her lecture, all of which reference Washington and can be found in multiple articles. So she really understands his power to cast sort of positive lights on her own activities.
Your work is very detailed, and it's obvious you went to great lengths in your research. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process and how you went about it before we get into more of the substance of her lectures and their impact and import?
Yeah, so she's a person. There's only one person who's she shows up occasionally, as I mentioned here and there. Granville Ganter wrote a wonderful article on her as part of Entrepreneurial Female Lecturing. She's included in that. But other than that, she kind of vanished. She was probably pretty well known by reputation in the 1780s into the 1790s, but she has no children. And she dies pretty impoverished, and so she has no papers. And there's only 5 letters of hers, 4 of which were to George Washington, 1 to Benjamin Franklin's daughter. So we see her briefly through there. What I was really fortunate to be able to do, and this really is part of the importance of these digital access we can get to newspapers now, particularly the very important American Antiquarian Society collections, is you can actually recover her newspaper ads. And you can kind of find enough of them across that you can begin to understand the scope of coverage. And so I was able to find over 150 advertisements or notices about her in the Philadelphia papers for the summer of 1787, wow. And over 300 across the country relating to her activities. And you could not have done this in a world before you had digitized newspaper access. Now, that's not so easy. If your name's O'Connor, there turns out to be a lot of O'Connors. Newspaper databases don't search very well for the O apostrophe, and the long S, the way the S in this period still looks like an F. There's lots of problems with it, but I read a lot of newspapers and I did a lot of searching, and you can sort of reconstruct this very expansive advertising campaign that she had across the early American states.
How did she come in contact with George Washington? I mean, how was it that he attended? You mentioned that the opening of the convention was delayed, and so would he have attended otherwise, do you think? Or was he looking for things to do? Was he aware that this was coming and wanted to attend? Fill us a little bit of the background on that and how it was that he attended the lecture.
Yeah, so she was giving lectures in Philadelphia. They moved to Philadelphia in April of 1787. She and her husband had left Dublin and London and come to the United States in 1786, and she starts in New York, running a very ambitious girls' school in New York, which she starts on a kind of British model. It's actually successful enough that she gives her final exams at Columbia College and has the Columbia College faculty help. And then her husband moves to Philadelphia because New York is, of course, the capital of the United States in this period, but all attention turns to Philadelphia for what we call the Constitutional Convention. And her husband goes to Philadelphia to actually be a short-term. It will turn out to be a short-term editorial position with one of the magazines. And she follows. This is a constant problem for her during her lifetime, which is her husband's always got a new idea, and they're either fleeing debts or following his ideas, and she has to sort of reset up, and she's the primary breadwinner for them. And in Philadelphia in April, she starts giving, advertising a course of lectures by a lady. Very shortly after that, she adds at the university, and she had been giving lectures in April prior to the convention starting, and Washington, Mary White Morris, and Washington describes going with Mary White Morris and some of her female friends to this lecture. And Washington, this is not so much in the book, but Washington actually spent a lot of his summer hanging with women. He liked the kind of conversation. He hangs with a group of women who we would think of as sort of salon leaders and interested in politics, including Elizabeth Willing Powell, the woman who famously asks, Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And Franklin says, it's a republic if you can keep it. And that's Elizabeth Willing Powell, and that's one of Washington's dear friends in the summer. So my own guess is he would have gotten there anyway, because he sort of was he was really interested in seeing what there was to do in Philadelphia, and he spent a lot of time with the Morrises.
You mentioned she advertised later that he had attended her lectures. Were there other ways that she capitalized on this connection to George Washington?
Yeah, so during that summer, she actually publishes. She's very interested. She's a sort of early adopter of expanding the works of Sir William Jones, who's going to be a very important person. He's actually a political reformer and jurist in England, and she publishes his poetry kind of rewritten in Washington's honor in the poem, in the papers, and that goes kind of viral in its own interesting ways, and again all tied into the lady lecturing at the university. So she expands that way. She will eventually end up in Alexandria, where she sets up a school. Washington declines to be explicitly on the board, but seems to support her, and then she will be in Charleston during Washington's Southern tour. And he, my own guess is, although there's no evidence of that she tried to meet him again at that point in her life. And so the two of them, in interesting ways, sort of continue to intersect through the 1780s and 1790s.
Part of the book can be framed, I think, as expanding the story of the Constitutional Convention beyond the men inside Independence Hall. Can you expand a little bit more on that and talk about the way Eliza Harriot does this and what she has achieved in doing this?
Yeah, so one of the big argument in the book is to really show how in the 17th and 1770s and 1780s we can see all these ways in which women, not all women, but a very a sort of important, influential group of women transatlantically in England, in Ireland, in France, and then in the United States, were pushing to imagine being included in politics. And we forget sometimes that this is a world where prior to the 1780s, the things that kept people from participating in politics were actually property qualifications and religious qualifications. So that was the big powerful aspect of who could not participate in politics. And it's actually in the 1770s that we can find the first person of African heritage voting in London, because he met the property and religious qualifications. And in this period, like a really great example of this that people don't always know about is there's a number of women's debating societies. They're called things like the Female Parliament, and they actually explicitly debate and advertise in the paper debating the inclusion of women in higher education, in voting, and in politics. And there was a speech given, the book talks about, by a young Princeton grad in 1783. Washington was there also, sort of arguing for women's inclusion in education and politics. And so I argue she represents this kind of ambition, this moment when who's going to participate in the constitutional state actually turns out to be somewhat open. And her presence in Philadelphia matters. I argue that the Constitution, the drafts of the Constitution include language that is possible, gender explicitly male, and all of those references disappear. So the Constitution becomes gender neutral in 18th century terms, and it uses a very consistent person, he designation to show that. And we know that because otherwise the interstate, I can say this here without having to explain it, the interstate rendition clause wouldn't apply to people like me, and we could commit all sorts of crimes and never be hauled back across state lines because that person, he, appears there. And so in that sense, the Constitution is very importantly gender neutral at a moment when state constitutions are beginning to swivel on this. And the gender neutrality of the Constitution matters because we know women vote in this period. Persons of color also vote in this period. And we see that in New Jersey. New Jersey had a gender neutral constitution. It explicitly is understood to include women and people of color, and women and people of color vote until they're disenfranchised in 1807. And so there's a space here that is contingent, that is open, where we're still trying to think about what does this new type of thing called a constitution do? That story is going to shift, but she helps us see how there's a sort of fluidity in this period and openness that might surprise us.
Does she do that explicitly, Professor Bilder? Is it more nuanced than that? And
I would win a Nobel Prize if I could prove, hey, Governor Morris, scratch out that line. It's an argument. It's an argument. There's no evidence about it. It's an argument about the way in which, once we understand the power of this movement, which the book has millions of examples of, we can now re-understand some of these changes in the Constitution as being open to it. It could be that nobody was thinking about it, but I don't think so. The fact that the Constitution becomes gender neutral seems to me to be incredibly important.
Well, I think one of the things that I encourage the readers to get your book, and because you expand on this quite well, I think, in the work, the topics that she covers in her lectures. And that's why I asked the previous question, is it explicit or is it more nuanced than that? The topics in her lectures are language, eloquence, poetry, taste, and criticism. I think I got those right.
Yeah, you got that. You are perfect.
And so you see those topics and you think constitutional convention and where's the fit, where's the influence, but it's a broader impact than the explicit language, perhaps, in those lectures. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, she represents, in terms of the sort of intellectual influences that she cares about, she represents a whole transatlantic idea about what mattered to we might think in this audience to participate as a participant, as a lawyer, as a politician. And so this is a really amazing moment where rhetoric and oratory has come sort of been rediscovered. Obviously the Romans did that, right? But this is really where people turn to the power of speaking, to the importance of being a good orator, and the power of that in particular for certain professions. And so politics and law, also the church, but politics and law are two of those three places. And she's very influenced by very influential writers out of Ireland, out of Dublin, the Sheridans, who really explain and publish books on how you could learn to do this by watching good examples. And that's what she's providing. And what's important in some ways about what she's doing is she's placing a female at the center of the example of what it looks like to learn to speak well, which is becoming an important part of law and politics. And we see this this sort of constellation of politics, law, and speaking in a whole lot of other places, right? It becomes very importantly. And she actually, remarkably, that summer, one of the speeches that she gives at her lecture is Demosthenes' Oration on the Crown, which was the classic sort of oratory text that people gave. Obviously, lots of sort of American male political leaders are like, this is the greatest speech ever. And she delivers that that summer, actually with Washington there, and the newspapers interpret it as a critique of the Rhode Island delegation for failing to show up. So they sort of take it and spin it about the convention. But she's really imagining herself as a model for sort of oratory. And she actually says this explicitly in correspondence she writes to the newspaper about herself, where she says the example of the female lecturer will show that American women are deserting the toilette and the parlor. And that's the sort of private rooms and the semi-private rooms for the college and the forum. And that's a pretty incredible claim to really say higher education, same kind of education as men, and then political participation.
That you've hit exactly on the theme I wanted also to expand on, and that is how important education is in this whole unfolding of what she's done for in the history of our country. And focusing attention on education is a very important first step, in our evolution, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things the book really tries to do, so there's a couple, sort of bigger things the book tries to do in an interesting way is sometimes women's history is sort of, particularly because of the dominance of sort of ideas of the Republican mother, is sort of pushed off to the side. Like it doesn't belong to mainstream American stories about politics and government. And this book really tries to argue, no, it does, like in a really important way. It's you can't not understand this as part of who participates in the constitutional state. And then a sort of second piece of that is it really tries to place why did people think education was so important? And how education becomes part of what we think of as parts of constitutionalism or constitutional politics. And here we really see in the 1770s and 1780s the argument that, and then it will become twisted later on to suggest, well, if you don't have an education, you shouldn't participate. But that's not the argument people are making here. The argument people are making is, to the degree you might think people can't participate, that's because you've excluded them from education.
Right.
And so if we give people education, then everyone will be able to participate. And to understand the political ambition in education is, I think, so significant in this period. And it really does explain how, this is the period of enormous expansion of public education in all sorts of ways. Congress will actually imagine a national university in this period. There's sort of all sorts of ideas about the sort of value of education for the constitutional state.
Well, it's one of those living examples of that suddenly the light goes on, and those who are framing that women can do this, obviously, and should be encouraged to do it and allowed to do it, if you will. And I mean, at that time, we take that for granted in some ways now, and in other ways we're still evolving, I suppose. But that struck me as the power of what she was doing at the time. Do you think she realized that? Was she coming at it in that way rather than flame throwing, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting question of sort of like, where you're writing about someone where you only have 5 letters. The interior, sort of the capacity to think about what the interior mind is thinking, we have to be a little bit speculative. But one thing that's interesting is, and she was very sophisticated because she had to make money. So she has to sell lecture tickets, and she has to persuade people to attend her schools because she is the primary breadwinner for their family. She represents a good reminder of how many women in this period actually do work. Obviously, that's true of African American women in this period, and particularly people like Eliza Harriot, who are the primary breadwinners. But I think she's quite conscious of it because her advertisements always sort of tilt in both directions. They always contain language that can be read as sort of aspirational if what you wanted was your daughter to be considered a lady in some kind of genteel, we might think of social status way. And then she also uses language and types of readings that would have telegraphed to people who were interested this kind of ambitious understanding of what women were capable of. But she's as a person who needs to make sure she's got people through the door, she's always very careful in advertising to sort of speak to a sort of complicated audience, and she does that actually even through the lens of sex and gender in her tickets. She has a wonderful second set of lectures that she never gives on the human mind. That's the faculties of the human mind, and she doesn't seem to ever give those. But she advertises that her tickets will work for 3 women or 2 women and 1 man. So she's advertising a female audience. I was always like, what was she going to do? Like knock 3 men out if they all showed up together? But she's encouraging men to come, but she's also explicitly encouraging women to come to be participants.
Fascinating. Are there, did you discover any transcripts of her lectures or notes where you had to rely mostly on her advertising, which is an amazing feat that you were able to?
Yeah, I mean, I would have given anything to have something like that. No, we don't have anything like that at all. It's all based, but the whole book is constructed really out of her advertising. But we do have, like, I'll read because this is such a wonderful set piece. 5 years after she gives her lectures, a young woman, Priscilla Mason, gives a speech at the Young Ladies Academy. And this has become a pretty well-known speech. It actually shows up on the AP US History exam as a document to explain. And this is a young woman. She's about 15 years old. She's speaking to a predominantly male audience in 1793 in Philadelphia. And she says, supposing now that we possessed all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, the Senate are shut against us. Who shut them? Man, despotic man, first made us incapable of the duty and forbid us the exercise. Let us by suitable education qualify ourselves for those high departments. They will open before us. And this is 1793, and she's 15 years old.
Wow.
And in front of a large crowd of people, she says it. And that's one of the first texts of speeches that we really begin to get of women speaking. It's a really wonderful set piece. I always like to imagine she was 10 years old, dragged along by her mom, heard Eliza Harriot, and that image stayed with her, because one of the things Eliza Harriot believes is that the female example is so powerful, and it's powerful to be emulated, to be imitated, but also to be improved on. She actually explicitly said that was the power of the example. You didn't have to be perfect, but people would imitate you, but they would improve on you. And she sees herself in that light. And I always like to think of the young Priscilla Mason imitating and improving on Eliza Harriot.
This is a fascinating discussion, and I encourage our audience to send in questions that you might have also. I have a few others that I could go on for some time, but a couple. After we read Female Genius, how do you think we rethink what the Constitution means, or approach to it?
I mean, one of the things that the book does in the later parts of the book, particularly because Eliza Harriot's life turns kind of sad at the end, is her life turns out to map pretty perfectly onto what happens to this model of possibly open voting. Constitutions, as they begin to be understood as very powerful, sort of this new genre, very powerful written instruments, as judiciaries begin to think about interpreting them in all sorts of ways, constitutions become ways to exclude people from power. And we can see this, the book goes through this, but a lot of other historians have written about this, how really in some ways beginning in the 1790s, but particularly in the 19th century, we see constitutions now beginning to explicitly exclude voters who are not, usually the language becomes by the 19th century, white male citizens. And so I think one of the things the book really helps us think about is what's our understanding of the framing period, and understanding that some of the things that we link to the framing period might have been there in terms of power, but they weren't yet settled or explicit. And I think this is a really, one of the things I wrote a piece recently for Fordham Law Review on 4 representatives of Native nations who come to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, shake hands with George Washington in a very public way, and how we can re-understand the federal government's relationship to Native nations by understanding these people and pressures outside of the inside room. So so for me, that's a big part of the book, both understanding a sort of different history of inclusion and suffrage, and also beginning to understand how important it is to look outside the room to so many people in this period who had ideas about what the new system ought to look like.
I think that's a great way to phrase it. And some of the some of the literature I've read about Native nations approaching the government at that time was learning about the education of the Native Americans who were going to petition the government. It's a remarkable story that's undercover, I'm afraid, and I'm so glad for professors and others like you are uncovering it.
Yeah, no, there's wonderful work that has been done and is being done by people really expanding our understanding of what that space would have looked like. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about the framing generation. Is it's a group of people in a particular moment of time, not, I always joke to my legal history class, like, it's not fewer people than are in this room today stuck inside a room, and those depictions of who's inside the room are so powerful. They're obviously at the National Archives, they're at Congress, and it's not that they're not important, they are important, but those aren't the only people in the space. They're not the only people with ideas. They're not the only people who are putting pressures in all sorts of interesting ways on how the system of government as a government is going to expand.
Fascinating story. Are there assumptions about marriage, family, children, the way women function in American society at the time that readers will find challenged as they learn more about Eliza and her work?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's a little bit sad. I mean, I think her husband, I don't know everything about their relationship, but he's a very ambitious but relatively unsuccessful person. And she's caught in a world where women, because of coverture, married women can't control their own income. She has a little of that because of a trust from her father. But so she reminds us of the struggle for women, particularly white married women, in a world prior to the married women's property laws in the mid and late 19th century, where women really just weren't able to own property in their own right. And then I think very importantly, the book reinterprets sort of within a long work of sort of women's history, a very powerful idea about why women should be educated that was pushed by Benjamin Rush. And Benjamin Rush, he's anti-slavery, he's very progressive, he's very interested in what should Americans do. And so he writes in the summer of 1787 a very important pamphlet on female education. And that has actually come to be a central text in how we understand women being educated in this period. And Rush argued basically that women should be educated to be mothers and wives of American citizens. And that's sort of how he understands it. That's an idea that becomes characterized by the term Republican motherhood. And so it gives women a role, but a role that's a very domesticated role. And the book shows how he's responding to Eliza Harriot. He's trying to drive her out of business, actually, that summer. And that very famous pamphlet is actually directed at her and the kind of education that that she was sponsoring. And to call, she's not Irish herself. She's born to British parents in Lisbon, Portugal, but her husband's Irish Catholic with a very Irish name, O'Connor. And but Washington even gets it wrong. He calls her O'Connell. He can't quite remember the Irish name, which is a little bit surprising because Washington actually had pretty extensive relations with Irish immigrants and Irish Americans. But Rush was not a fan. And the ending, which is often seen as a good thing, of a wife and daughter of an American citizen, one can hear, someone like me would hear in that a sort of nativist anti-Irish argument. Her husband goes on to write a publicity pamphlet for Washington, basically around Georgetown, and he describes himself as a citizen of America. And so I always wonder if there was a little bit like, and John O'Connor's like, okay, I might not get to be an American citizen yet, but I will describe myself as a citizen of America, of this ambitious idea.
Well, thank you so much for this. I'm going to turn to some questions from our audience and then wrap up with another question. Is there any evidence that Abigail Adams was aware of Eliza Harriot?
Oh, I would, if you can think of people who you would have loved to have put in a room together, Eliza Harriot and Abigail Adams would be two of those people. I just was speaking at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and they were saying, people from the Adams papers were saying, she would have loved this. No evidence at all. And Eliza Harriot actually moves progressively southward. It's one of the things that's something that we really have to struggle with is the ways in which her educational model turns out to be more successful for her in an enslaved economy. And so she doesn't go north towards Boston. At the time, of course, the Adamses are in England. They will come back, not John Adams is in England, and so they don't get to touch. But it would be a wonderful, and obviously the very famous Abigail Adams's letter about remember the ladies is so important in in sort of showing us how other women are beginning to think about it.
Yeah. Another question: which of her ideas continue to have impact beyond her death? I think you've described some of that already, certainly.
Yeah, I think the model of education, and she does things, for example, borrowing from Irish educational models, where she has the girls read out loud and give public examinations at the end, which was a way of showing examples. That model in 1786 in New York is very rapidly copied. You could have figured that out from other places, but she may be the progenitor of that model in the United States. Her model of female speaking will be true of younger women's academies, but it will be a while before there's, you really have to move towards the 19th century before you get a generation of really incredible female orators, Anna Clark, Maria Stuart, Frances Wright. It'll be a little bit later. So she doesn't quite get the kind of influence around female speaking that we might hope.
Another question from our audience. Do you have any favorite anecdotes about Eliza Harriot that may not have made it in the book, or some that did?
Oh, well, I think my favorite anecdote about her, there is no portrait of her. There's two lovely pictures in the book of her uncle and cousin, but so I couldn't, you don't have a sense of her from portraits, and there's only these few letters from Washington, but those letters date from when she is in Alexandria, and her husband's taking off for Edenton, and she's going to have to shut down her school. And so she writes Washington asking if she could come visit to get advice from him and Martha Washington. And so Washington says, sure, she can come visit Mount Vernon. And then, having invited herself, she basically says, well, unfortunately, I don't have a carriage. And so Washington then has to write, okay, I'll send the carriage for you. And, Washington was a pretty intimidating person. He was a very formal person, and the kind of self-confidence. I mean, she was respectful, but she did not think she was an inferior to George Washington. And to get Washington to invite yourself, stay for 5 days, and get the carriage sent for you is, I think, tells us something about the power of her own self-confidence.
Last question, and then I want to thank you so much for your time today. And that is, what's next? What's next for you? You've touched on a lot of important topics in your career, and what are you thinking about down the road?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I remember as a very young professor, I was like, I'm never going to write on the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to stay away from that. And now I find myself very much in the Constitutional Convention. And
it's remarkable that you're finding new things about it. I mean, it's got to be encouraging. And it's, as I said at the outset, we're all grateful that you're doing it.
Well, there's so many, in a funny way, we've looked so traditionally at the convention that and one of the wonderful things about so many resources we can now reach digitally is that in the old days, one would have had to spend weeks tracking up and down in the United States looking for stuff. And now you can do it, from the comfort of your computer. Still, you have to go because not everything is there. What I'm really interested in now is one of the things that Washington does that summer when he's in Philadelphia is he goes and revisits the sites of the Revolution, particularly Valley Forge and several sites that were part of the Philadelphia campaign. And in that sense, we sometimes forget that the summer of 1787 was the 10th anniversary of sort of one of the lowest parts of the American Revolution. It's when they lost Philadelphia and Washington has to go to Valley Forge. And it's really it's a moment where he makes some military mistakes. He's very vulnerable from people in the military. People aren't at all convinced he's the right person for the job. And the country really looks like, could completely collapse. And so I'm really interested in thinking about how might Washington's own sense of the anniversary looking backwards towards 1787, and then his sense of what the new nation might possibly look like, how those two sort of stories come together. And very importantly, on a lot of these trips, he's accompanied by William Lee, the enslaved man who will be really sort of Washington's right-hand man for most of his life. And so that reminds us of the sort of presence of in slavery and enslavement in that sort of story looking back and going forward. So I'm not quite sure where I'm going with that, but I've been learning to read a lot of military maps about various battles, which has been something really new and fun for me. So
keep going. We appreciate your great work. And I want to thank you very much, Professor Bilder, for your fascinating presentation today, the work you're doing and illuminating something near and dear to our hearts here and at the Supreme Court Historical Society. And I want to thank also our partners in these undertakings. We have partnered recently with the Federal Judicial Learning Centers, which I worked on and helped create in my prior positions, but we have a great one in the Justice Kennedy Learning Center and at the federal courthouse in Sacramento. And Chief Judge Kim Mueller there is really working hard on programs like this to help educate the public about our constitutional system. And also we've partnered with the Judicial Learning Center in St. Louis, and Judge Rod Sipple has been so very helpful to us along the ways, and we're grateful for their participation. I want to remind our viewers that copies of Female Genius, I'm going to hold it up here and advertise it shamelessly. They're available in their Society's gift shop at www.supremecourtgifts.org. And I also want to remind everyone our next virtual program is the Society's Law Day celebration on Wednesday, May 4th at noon. That would be Eastern time. So it'll be back to breakfast on the West Coast. Join us. Professor Jonathan Lurie will be speaking on Chief Justice William Howard Taft and the Judicial Conference, a centennial retrospective. It's the 100th anniversary of the Judicial Conference, an important marker in our history. Registration is available at the Society's website, again at www.supremecourthistory.org. Another reminder that a survey will go out later this afternoon to everyone who is registered in advance, and we really hope you will respond. We do want to make these programs as rich and accessible to as many people as possible. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again, Professor Bilder, for this fascinating discussion and a very interesting read.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.